Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Watching Humans podcast. I am Skylar Thomas. I'm joined by George Wuerthner, and George Wuerthner is a gem of information. I just wish more people, like the people in charge, would listen to him. And today's topic is it's a good one, in my opinion. And our thoughts have been aligning on this. I've been putting out some posts recently about fake conservation, the demise of Audubon, and George just happens to have put out a few things on that topic on the Wildlife News. You're quite the writer, George. I'm impressed how much you produce. I did include in the description of this video, if anyone wants to reference it later, the bit that you wrote about Audubon and their embrace of cattle. And I also will touch a little, we're going to mostly talk about that, and we're going to touch a little bit on the criticism video I did making fun of Audubon's hooves on the ground, wings in the sky, which is just a masterpiece of incompetence or intentional deception. It's so bad. Georgia, what should we start with?
Well, why don't we just start with, we'll use Audubon as emblematic of a lot of groups and what happens. This recent thing that I wrote had to do with the fact that they have begun over the last few years a thing called conservation ranching.
Yep.
Where they promote certain ranchers who they say are meeting conservation goals. Yep. And try to help them get a higher price for their product through, helping them sell it. Most of the sales are back east, where they don't see the impacts of the cattle ranching in the West that they're promoting.
But, so we can already say goodbye to the whole local narrative that also goes along with the production of this food. Because I always hear, "Oh, we're producing local food," so it's not even being sold locally.
Well, some of it is, but if you look at a map of the stores that they promote it in, they are mostly in the Midwest and back east. And they tend to be things like natural food stores and appealing to that segment of society that wants to eat food that they feel is less environmentally impactful. And, and so that's the sort of the context for this. And while it's hard to know exactly what the Audubon looks at as their checklist of do good things by the ranchers they're promoting, what they do is they overlook the overall cost accounting of livestock production. So I'll just give you a small example. Let's say one of the ranchers that they promote might do something like fence a riparian area. And riparian areas are these areas along streams that, particularly in the West, are very important wildlife habitat. 70 to 80% of all species utilize riparian areas in the West. So if you're a rancher and you fence your riparian area to keep the cattle out of there, except maybe limited access, Audubon will look upon that as a good thing, and maybe they promote that particular.
Is that not also affecting wildlife that would like to access that riparian area? Oh, oops. 1 second. Lost George, but he's still there.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, there he is.
So to continue with that, they'll look at one or two things like that a rancher might do that has possibly more positive impact on birds, but then ignore all the other things that go along with ranching, particularly in the West, that are almost impossible to avoid. And if you did that accounting, you would find that even the best ranching operations have a tremendous impact on birds.
Yeah.
And so logically, I think if you were interested in birds and just environmental issues in general, you would be opposed to livestock production, particularly by beef cattle, in general, as a poor public policy. And of course, the response you might get from the Audubon is, well, we're going to have ranching anyway. Well, of course, you're going to have ranching anyway if you keep on promoting ranching as some sort of positive thing for conservation. So let me just go into a few of the problems with the accounting. For example, most ranching operations in the West rely on irrigated fields for pasture and hay production. So you're taking water out of rivers that would otherwise support aquatic ecosystems, including the insects and the fish there. Okay, now look at it from a bird's perspective. A lot of birds forage along rivers because there are more insects, if they're like swallows and things like that. And then the fish might provide food to things like eagles and osprey that are fish eaters, or kingfishers that eat smaller fish. So the damage to the river by water withdrawals for pasture and irrigation are really significant. Also, those pastures and irrigated fields like alfalfa fields are biological deserts, and most people don't look at them that way because they're green, but they're all the same species of plant over many, many acres. If you add it up around the West, it would be millions of acres of land is alfalfa fields. One species of plant being irrigated, which is a very thirsty plant, by the way. It needs a lot of water. And so you say, well, all that's lost habitat. Yeah, sure, you might have an occasional crane or something land in a field like that, but in general, it's limited habitat for most bird species. Furthermore, following the same line of thought, most of those irrigated pastures and hayfields were carved out of native plant communities that did support a wide variety of species. So, for example, in a lot of parts of the West, those alfalfa fields now were previously, say, sagebrush steppe habitat or willow habitat, all of which were much more important to native species, things like sage grouse and sage thrashers. And then you look at other ways that the livestock industry sort of destroys habitat. Another possible way is that in having trampling of soil crusts, and soil crusts hold the soil together in a lot of parts of the West. They're bacteria, lichens, fungi that grow on the soil surface. And among the things that they do that's positive, one is they trap nitrogen from the air and transport it into the soil, so enriching the soil. But another thing that they do in many parts of the West is they slow or prevent the establishment of annuals like cheatgrass. And cheatgrass is an exotic from Asia that's gotten established in large parts of the West. And it is very flammable. And in fact, it can burn every single year. And it is the main reason why the sagebrush steppe, which is one of the largest plant communities in the West, covering hundreds of millions of acres, but used to cover a lot more in the past, is disappearing because sagebrush cannot tolerate frequent fires, and cheatgrass can. And so the grazing by livestock increases the amount of cheatgrass establishment, and thereby helps to eliminate the sagebrush steppe. Those are just some examples of how, if you just started looking into the impacts of livestock beyond just a simple, fact that they may promote one or two or a dozen species of birds, the overall impact is tremendous.
You said a lot there, and I'm going to represent the people who don't have as good of an understanding of this as you and try and simplify just one part of it. A lot of people will see a video such as Audubon put out of plants. Oh, look, there's plants there. It must be good. And not go to the second step and say, those are not the plants that are supposed to be there.
Right.
And like you mentioned, cheatgrass. And cheatgrass is actually something very bad. And yet you'll have a promotional video showing that every now and then you can actually find a native animal trying to exist there and say, hey, look, that's great. It's nature. Right. But it's not. It's a problem. Right. It's just not as bad as a factory farm or something of that sort. But it was I'll give people a teaser. It's in my members section. Eventually I'll release it. Not once did they show a native plant in the entire film. Hooves on the ground, wings in the sky, which is astonishing to me considering that they continuously talked about promoting native plant life. They couldn't get one shot in the entire film.
Well, another thing that's part of this larger issue, it goes beyond ranching in the West, ranching any place, livestock production any place. But there's a lot of documentation that one of the biggest factors in climate change, global warming, is the production of methane by primarily cattle and its contribution to raising temperatures around the world, which again, if you were concerned about bird species and what's happening to them, you would be trying to promote things that didn't contribute to that global climate warming. And it's a very significant amount. It depends on, the study that you look at, but it's anywhere from about 14% of climate warming factors all the way up to 50%. And people wonder, well, how do you get 50%? Well, it has to do with what you include, just sort of like how the conservation ranching ignores a lot of factors. Even the contribution that people calculate of livestock contribution to climate warming leaves out stuff. And so the larger figure puts in things like the clearing of tropical forests to create pasture in places like Brazil. Mm-hmm. It includes the loss. I mean, even most of the pastures of cattle in places like the Midwest and Eastern United States are made by carving out forests. And forests are better at storing carbon and taking carbon out of the atmosphere than grasslands are. So anyway, the point is no matter what figure you use, even the 14% is a very significant figure. And again, they're ignoring that contribution. And it would seem that an environmental group would be trying to inform its membership of how it, as an individual, can make changes. I mean, the simplest thing that people can do in this country is reduce or eliminate beef from their diet. That would, you can do other things like try to get a car that gets better gas efficiency. You can try to insulate your home. I mean, these are all things that are worth talking about. But most people, the simplest thing is just stop eating beef. And if this country as a whole did that, and of course across the world, we would have a significant, we would probably be even at the point of reversing climate warming.
And George, you're not vegan. This is coming from someone who is not vegan, but you can still acknowledge the benefit.
Oh yeah, well, I primarily eat vegetables. I mean, that's the largest part of my diet. But yeah, I eat salmon once in a while and chicken once in a while, and partly, as a practical matter because I travel a lot, and it's hard to get fresh vegetables in rural America. And when I go into a cafe and I want a salad and they come out with some, iceberg lettuce with a few carrot strips, it just doesn't satisfy me. So I look for other things. But anyway, I'm not an absolutist on that. But that's my point. Even a reduction, if people were eating beef, every day like some people do, and you dropped it down to once a week, that starts making a difference if a significant number of people did that.
And people really hate that message, so they're going to tune us out if we keep talking about it. But I will mention that it really plays into what Audubon is doing, because make people feel better about continuing to make a bad choice. Hey, you don't have to give up beef. Just buy the beef we're telling you to buy. Oh, well, now pat yourself on the back instead of doing what you should be doing.
Yeah. Well, there's a saying I have, and particularly I apply it to the Western livestock industry. There's no right way to do the wrong thing. And
thank you.
And in the West, particularly because it's an arid climate, it accentuates all the negatives of livestock production. As I previously mentioned about riparian areas back in the Eastern United States, and I'm not an advocate of growing cows in Maryland or Kentucky or something like that. But the fact is cattle are less inclined to spend time in riparian areas because they have green grass every place around because it rains. Whereas in the West, you get far away from streams, you get very little green grass, and cattle prefer to eat green grass. So they concentrate in those riparian areas. So raising cattle in the West, to my mind, is the worst thing you can do. And yes, there are better ways and there are worse ways to raise livestock, but people have to start asking, is there any reason why we need to do this? I mean, just another factor is it's one of the most inefficient ways to produce protein. I mean, even if your goal was to produce protein, and again, I'm going to sound like I'm an advocate for something else like raising chickens, but just on a comparison basis, you can get on the same amount of feed far more meat out of raising chickens than you can out of cattle because they have an inefficient conversion rate. So there are a lot of reasons why livestock production, particularly cattle production, is a poor choice, even if your whole goal was to produce meat.
I want to spend a little bit more time on the riparian area topic because I can really relate to what you're saying about how vital it is here in the West. So much of the land is just like, especially with the temperatures increasing the way that they are. And I've been documenting the devastating goat grazing program that has just swept the state, and these riparian areas that are just the only place left to find shade, to find cover, to find native plants. Maybe if you're lucky, a tiny bit of water are being fed to livestock. And it's heartbreaking because I know that the wildlife, that was their last possible refuge, and they're actually being fenced into these areas, which blows my mind. I feel like that has to be illegal. Now I want to talk about ranchers and the fact that they're promoted as wildlife friendly and stewards of the land, connected to the land. They're being rewarded for now at some places fencing cattle out of the riparian area. But why wouldn't people that connected to the land already just understand that that's devastating and you can give your cattle water somewhere else without destroying the riparian area? Do they really not know that?
A lot of it has to do with tradition. I mean, I hear this all the time from ranchers. This is the way my grandfather did things,
Right.
and it worked for him, so there's no reason for me to change. So that's part of it. The other is usually, and this is not the case everywhere, but usually it requires more human intervention or management to manage cattle, say, to keep them out of the riparian area, because then you got to build some sort of water source. But you're still taking water out of springs and streams that are so important for wildlife. But nevertheless, you avoid some of the compaction and destruction of the riparian areas, which if you had to pick one part of a typical Western landscape, the estimates is that riparian areas make up about 1% of the plant communities in the West. But they're, like I previously mentioned, essential for 70 to 80% of the wildlife. So that is a high priority area to avoid with cattle. And it just isn't done in most places. And, another thing is you don't get penalized, even by Audubon, for the most part, for doing things poorly. So we have... the average rancher has no incentive to change often and to continue doing what they want to do. I want to make one more point to broaden this discussion a little bit more the way people think about stuff. Another sort of impact that is least or not appreciated much is the impact of cattle grazing on insects. A lot of insects are very specific to certain forbs, or what we call flowers, butterflies and so forth. And a lot of cattle grazing can eliminate or reduce that, or like hummingbirds is an example. If you've been to a place that's been grazed by cattle in late summer when the flowers are normally in bloom and they're all gone, what's that doing for hummingbirds that have to travel further to get enough energy? But it also affects like other things like native bees in the West. People don't appreciate native bees, but most native bees live in the ground, in the soil. And, I'm not talking about honeybees. I'm talking about the native bees that are there. Like Oregon, for example, has over 800 native bees. I read a paper once about southern Utah that they said there was over 400 species of native bees. Almost all these species are living in the ground. And so you take a big, heavy animal like a beef cattle, pounding the ground, you get a lot of soil compaction, which affects the ability of these below surface ground livers to survive. And then meanwhile, you are eating all their food, which is the flowers that are no longer available to be pollinated and for them to extract honey and so forth. So that has replications all the way up to the food chain. So those insects some of them are at least consumed by birds. And so we've eliminated some of their food resources in terms of the birds' food resources by the soil compaction and changes that result from this. So I think that when you look all the way from the bottom up, and what, this is one of the things, the tricks people should be aware of that happens is you can find an exception to any generalization. So there are some species that we would quote say benefit from cattle grazing. In other words, the habitat changes that result from having cattle out there may improve things for a few species. But that's kind of like saying you find, I call it the 99-year-old grandmother who smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Okay, I can find exceptions to the generalization that you shouldn't smoke cigarettes, but that doesn't mean overall smoking cigarettes is good for your health just because you find a few people that live a long time without getting cancer. Exactly. And so people have to be very aware of when they say certain species benefit. And then there's another sidebar to that whole thing of species benefit. In many cases, the species that benefit are what we would call generalists. In other words, they can live in a lot of different habitats. They're not specific to any particular landscape. And so, their numbers might increase. And then you have things like cowbirds that are nest parasites on other bird species that, they increase with cattle grazing, All right, so I can point to cowbirds as a species that benefits from cattle grazing. But that, if you were to look at the impact of the increase in cowbirds on other bird species, it would be ridiculous to claim.
I got to stop. We have to spend a minute on that because Audubon Society is associated with birds, and you'd think that these people of all people would be the ones that understood the demise of other bird species by the promotion of the couple of birds that have really taken to ranching operations.
Right.
What, do they not know that, or is it just not? Does the truth just not matter anymore? They're on board with.
I think there's an evolution that happens in a lot of conservation organizations. What happens is, especially the larger they get, the more they have to appeal to a broader audience, partly for fundraising, partly for the political power that it presents. And so that tendency means that you are less willing to criticize any segment of society, and you try to find ways to, quote, get along with that segment. And the way that Audubon is looking upon it is that the private lands are a big segment of ranching lands that are private in the West are a big segment of wildlife habitat. However, I would say to them, one, if they push for better enforcement of regulations and changes in regulations, they would improve those ranch lands in terms of birds. But then they're neglecting all the public lands, which in the West is a large proportion of the land base. And if you could just get livestock grazing off of public lands, you would have a very significant improvement in bird populations in those lands for the most part. But I wanted to make the point of, I started out saying that, Audubon is not alone here. That is, I see this trend in all sorts of environmental groups where, let's take an organization that's in past worked for against logging. Well, after a while, they start saying, well, not all logging is bad because, it improves things for, this animal or that animal. I saw this I lived in Vermont for a short time. I'm going to tell a story here. Shortly after I moved to Vermont, I went to a meeting that the Vermont Fish and Game was having about whether to log one of their wildlife management areas. And person after person got up and said, yeah, we need to get more logging because it will improve the habitat for white-tailed deer. Now, because white-tailed deer like to feed on early successional species of plants and trees. And so the first question you got to ask is, how rare are white-tailed deer? Well, they're not rare at all in Vermont, you know. And so do you really need to increase the number of white-tailed deer? What is rare? Well, what is rare is species that depend on old-growth forests, and old-growth forests are almost non-existent in Vermont. And further on in that meeting, I was kind of silent the whole time because I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. That finally a guy gets up and he says, we got to do something about the old growth crisis here in Vermont. I thought, finally somebody who gets it. And he said, the problem is we have too many old trees, which is totally a false statement. But I was like, I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And so that's an example where the people can point to the increase in habitat for white-tailed deer and then make the case that we need more logging instead of asking, in the case of Vermont, I'll use that. Almost the entire state has been logged over at one time for clearing for pastures or forestry. The largest tract of on-log forest in the whole state of Vermont is 100 acres. And the biggest trees in Vermont exist in cemeteries. And the funny thing about that is, somebody's been buried there 200 years, so they don't log in the cemetery. They have it's a sacred place, right? It's the few places that are off limits to logging in Vermont. So I would go around to cemeteries to take pictures to show people this is what a sugar maple can achieve in size. Here's an example of a sugar maple that's 3 or 4 feet across, which you don't see almost any place. You don't see it in the national forest there that have been logged over. You don't see it in most places. So people get this landscape amnesia, what I call it. In other words, their point of reference is a degraded landscape. So they don't even realize what has been lost. That's the same thing in riparian areas around the West. I have pictures I show in some of my slideshow talks where I have this beautiful in terms of the way people would normally view it, a stream that's about maybe 20 feet across, and it has green banks, grass growing on, looks very like a perfect trout stream. And then I turn right from that picture and I turn around and it's fenced, and it's been fenced for 100 years. And that stream narrows down to being about 1 foot across. And instead of 12 inches deep, it is like 3 feet deep. And there's grass overhanging it and really thick. But most people see the thing outside the fence because they've never seen the thing inside the fence. And they think the thing outside is a good example of a healthy stream. And that's, again, this point of reference is so degraded around the West that you can get away with saying stuff like cattle grazing improves conservation for birds.
My Tuesday morning co-host is fighting to save Tomales Park, where Cal Fire is using the usual BS about, we got to thin this thing out.
Yeah.
And what they're talking about is there's life there. There's abundant life. It's wonderful. And, oh, shit, we better bring this to an end. And, the California Coastal Commission approved it. And you had a meeting just like you described. All these people, oh, thank goodness you're going to get rid of that abundant life there. All right. It's pretty heartbreaking. But again, I look at the urban setting. I look at our urban setting where I live. The leaf blowers never stop, and between every plant is dead, bare soil. Humans have decided that there just shouldn't be vegetation on the ground, and this is now being applied to nature. It's like, keep it looking like someone's carefully manicured garden or something.
Yeah, well, the question you have to ask, and I even use this response into the whole notion that Native American burning was essential to healthy populations of trees and plant communities is, these plant communities existed for millions of years before any people colonized North America. Ponderosa pine, which is one of the prime trees that are the excuses used that we have to manipulate them, log it, and do prescribed burning in it to make it healthy. And ponderosa pine has existed for 55 to 60 million years in North America, and humans only got here maybe 15,000 years ago. So you got to say, how did ponderosa pine survive all those millions and millions of years without human intervention and management and manipulation? And I would say the same thing for almost any plant community around, that the idea that we benefit, it's just sort of what I call a gardening mentality, to bring it back to your urban situation. Humans seem to like to fiddle around with nature to quote, improve things. And I'm not totally against that idea. I mean, obviously this is the thing people have to realize. Agriculture is one of the most destructive things that humans do on the planet. And obviously, if we're going to eat, we got to do a little destruction. But that doesn't mean we should just support it mindlessly everywhere as if it's a positive good. We have to recognize that what you do in agriculture is very damaging to native ecosystems. You're usually promoting one or two species of plants or animals at the expense of hundreds of other species that would otherwise occupy that terrain. And you're often having to even destroy and kill, kill predators so they don't prey on the cattle, or try to eliminate insects that may feed on the plant communities, because you've got 2,000 acres of corn. It makes a perfect place for, some insect to attack because it doesn't have a diversity of plants. So I think it's really important that people realize, yes, we're going to have some food, and yes, we have to grow it. But the idea that we should try to reduce the footprint, particularly in the more marginal habitats, the arid West is the worst place you could grow livestock. And I don't want to endorse livestock growing in Kentucky or Missouri or someplace like that, but I can also make the case that it does less damage there than in the West.
And bringing it back to the stewards of the land, my daddy did it, and his daddy did it, and it worked for them, so it works for me. The thing is, it's not working. The land has had enough, and the water's gone. And instead of these people changing, they're even being offered transition programs, and they're like, no tradition. And I'm like, you guys have been here for 150 years and brought millions of years of health to an end in that period of time. So stop being proud of your tradition. And the only way you're alive at all is through massive subsidies to keep something that should have never existed in California going.
Right. Well, I have a story to tell that makes that point. Years ago, I used to teach the field ecology classes for several Western universities. And I had a group of students. I'd always try to have them exposed to opposing viewpoints to my own, just to consider. So I always had them meet with this rancher that lived in Montana to get the rancher's point of view. And this happened over the course of a whole day, and I'm going to say it in a few seconds. But first, we're overlooking this valley, and he says, when I was a kid, there were 6 other families that lived down here, and we used to get together every Thursday for potluck dinners. All the families would get together. And then, they gradually, my grandfather and then my father bought up those ranches and made it part of our ranch. And then a little later on, he tells me that, his kids have to get on a bus and travel an hour and a half one way to get to a local school, because when he was younger, he rode his horse to a school just down the road 3 miles away. But that's when there were 6 other families in that valley that also had kids. And then he said, and I can't get a vet anymore because, there used to be a lot of ranchers here, and now there's just, like my ranch, which is a pretty big ranch. And finally, he tells me about his wife hates living on the ranch because she has nobody to talk to. She's just by herself all the time. So she doesn't have that social thing. And his kids are upset because they can't be on the football team or the debate team or whatever, because they have to ride the bus back an hour and a half at night. And so what he was describing was, to get to your point, is the whole social disintegration of the ranching industry there. And meanwhile, he's telling the kids, the college students, ranching is sustainable. It's been here for 100 years, and it will be here for another 100 years. And what he was describing was the whole decline of the ranching industry. The reason he had to have a larger and larger ranch is because you can't make it on a small amount of land, because it was degraded. In other words, compared to his grandpappy's days, the landscape has been degraded by the cattle grazing. So now you have more land to make the same amount of, raise the same number of cattle. And the expectations of ranchers have changed. He wanted to put all his kids through college. Well, that costs money. So he has to make more money than his grandfather did, who was living in a one-room cabin. And anyway, it's exactly to what you say. And the reason they survive is exactly because they're both economic and environmental subsidies. Economic subsidies, like if A drought comes along, you can apply for drought, assistance that gives you money to keep buying hay. The environmental costs are a lot of the things we already talked about. You dry up rivers, you shoot predators, you eliminate the habitat for many species. Those are environmental costs, the climate warming, that we don't internalize into the cost of your hamburger at McDonald's or wherever you're buying hamburgers these days.
It almost sounds like not only what you said, but he actually caused the situation where he was when he admitted that he bought up those other farms. It's like, oh, okay, so you drove the people out and then complained that the people aren't there anymore.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. I don't think when they bought those ranches, they realized that it was going to have the social effects that it has. But
I'm sorry, but boo-hoo. I can't think of a category of people whose living gets more pity and they receive so much from the government while they continue to complain. I'm like, everyone else has to adjust. Right. Like if your lifestyle isn't working out, you have to adjust or perish, but not in this case.
Well, and that is there's two other points that are happening here that one, the average age of ranchers is really going up. In other words, young people don't want to be on ranches for the most part. I had two former girlfriends, both of whom came from ranching families. And one grew up on the edge of Montana and North Dakota on a ranch. There were 5 girls. None of them stayed on the ranch. And my girlfriend couldn't wait. As soon as she got to college, it was like, I'm out of here. And the other girlfriend's a good example too. Her family had a ranch in Montana, north of Missoula. And she wound up getting a PhD, for example. Her brother became an engineer at Apple Computers. The point being, none of them wanted to work back on the ranch anymore. And so that's a crisis for a lot of these ranchers because they don't have anybody following in their footsteps.
It's interesting because that's also romanticized, though, isn't it? That life out on the range away from everybody. That's what's supposed to be so appealing about it. But nobody actually wants to do it.
Well, and especially because the number of ranchers are declining. The ranchers are getting bigger and bigger to be somewhat economically efficient. In other words, because of the degraded landscape, they need more and more land to run. That means there's fewer people operating on these ranches.
Which brings us to the lie of grass-fed beef. They need more. They need more and more land to produce very little, and every bit of that land that's being given to cattle is being taken away from wildlife, in my opinion. You might find some wildlife there, and you have the specific cases, like you pointed out, some wildlife have actually learned how to use it to their advantage. But for the most part, it's bad.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up that point because there's a widespread belief, particularly among sort of the more liberal, health-conscious people, that grass-fed beef is better for you. And what it ignores, and I'm not going to sound like I'm an advocate for CAFO, confined, cattle operations. I'm not. But just in terms of climate warming, to the point that you made, grass-fed beef puts out a lot more methane over time because it takes longer. Grass is not a very good thing to eat in terms of energy production compared to feeding them, corn or something like that that's higher in energy, like in a CAFO. So it takes longer for a cow to get to the, quote, slaughter weight. And that whole time it's emitting methane into the atmosphere. And there are any number of studies that show from just a climate warming perspective that the grass-fed beef is worse that way. And then there's all the other residual impacts. Grass-fed beef are, destroying riparian zones. We're watering rivers to grow the pasture and the alfalfa or whatever, the hay that's fed in the winters and so forth. So if I come to the conclusion, and this is what I hope people come to the conclusion, there, again, no right way to do the wrong thing. And that is that you ought to conclude that raising cattle, particularly for any way you raise it, whether it's a CAFO situation or grass-fed, is bad for the planet, and eliminate that from your diet.
I got to wonder how much money they're spending lying to people about what you just said. Like this summer, I was at the airport and everywhere plastered these massive posters of someone dressed as like a scientist and then cattle in the background. And it said, fighting the war against climate change by promoting our cattlemen. and it was CaliforniaResilient.org. So, and it's the Cattlemen's Association. They just have all these different names that they operate under. But I'm like, how much money did you spend to have this message everywhere that is not the truth?
Right.
Instead of just changing. I mean, come on, they always get called good people. Don't good people want to change for the better of everyone instead of just stubbornly staying in the past?
I mean, if I want to have a little sympathy for the ranchers, and I don't have a whole lot, but I have a little bit, that a lot of these guys are, older. They're my age or older, and the idea of changing to something else at that point in their life is almost beyond their comprehension. But in most cases, most ranchers are actually, compared to the average American, rich. Now, they may not have a lot of money in their bank account, but even a small ranching operation in most parts of the West is worth millions of dollars in terms of the land. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted to, you could sell that land and then get out of ranching. And then, of course, the response, people say, well, is it going to become a subdivision or something like that? Well, two things to consider there. The amount of land that's occupied by urbanized land in the urbanized landscapes in the West footprint is very, very insignificant, actually, in a lot of states. For example, in Montana, 0.17% of the land is considered urbanized. And yet grazing and the raising of alfalfa and so forth occupy 70% of the state, if you count the public lands as part of that number. So, I mean, the footprint of the livestock industry in Montana is vastly outweighs any kind of subdivision and urbanization in the state. And
you sympathized with them being older.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure it's hard to change, but if you're going to make that excuse for an older person, then we've also removed the advantage of the wisdom that's supposed to come with being older. If you're not going to, if you're not going to set an example for younger generations by showing wisdom, then you're saying everyone else just needs to make excuses not to change too.
Well, possibly. I'm just saying that you can see why there's a resistance to change, because, and the other part is, in most rural areas, communities, the employment opportunities are pretty insignificant, and most ranchers, I went to a concert a couple of summers ago in Montana, and the guy who was the band leader said that he had sold his ranch and all his cows just the year before, and it was the first time he wasn't losing money. And he was willing to admit that. And so why do people do it? Partly is because there's status in being a rancher. There's this whole love of the cowboy. There's status in the community. Being a rancher, you see it all the time when there's a public meeting or something. Even conservation groups, because they lionize the livestock industry. A rancher gets up to talk. He's given more credibility on the subject matter, whatever it might be, that he knows nothing about anyway, but he gets more credibility. I'll give you another example. I had my girlfriend who moved from ranching in North Dakota eventually worked her way into being in charge of the prison system in Montana. And she was always advocating for less prisoners and no private prisons and all that. But the legislature, composed mostly of ranchers, would just, put her down and say, you don't know anything about this stuff. Of course, just because they run a ranch, they think they know more about that topic than anybody who's been doing it for a while. So that's my point. There's a certain amount of cultural tendency to lionize these folks.
I'm gonna bring us back to Audubon, since that's what I advertised people to, but we got to do an entire episode on the connection between urban sprawl and ranch land in a future episode.
Sure.
That's another really deceptive one.
Right. Exactly.
It may not be a significant percentage in Montana, but it's happening in California at an alarming rate. But God, so much with the Audubon. You wrote multiple articles in just the last couple of weeks about the conservation ranching and etc. And you did talk about a few species that may benefit, but several years ago, Audubon put out something promoting that, hey, cattle graze grass to the right height for wildlife. And I just thought, no one asked the very next question. What height is that? In what species?
Right.
I mean, it's not possible that cattle moving through and just destroying everything in their path is the right height, especially not the right height for multiple species.
Well, I'll give you an example of that. To your point, sage grouse, which are being considered for endangered species listing, they've disappeared from about half of their original territory.
Which Audubon claimed they're saving via ranching.
Yeah, right. Require about 10 inches of residual cover left after grazing. And that, if you're any familiar with most public lands, if there's 4 inches left, you're lucky. And of course, same on private lands, it's often, that's another thing people don't understand. As bad as things are on public lands like the BLM and Forest Service, if you were to statistically look across ranch lands across the West, private lands are in worse shape than the public lands. But nevertheless, the point being that, so in terms of a sage grouse, you need to leave a lot more grass there. And again, getting back to sage grouse also, chicks, when they're younger, the first 6 weeks of their lives depend on forbs, in other words, flowers, but not any flowers. Certain flowers they like to eat and other ones they don't. And so again, livestock proponents who don't know one flower from another, or at least what flowers sage grouse like, say, well, we graze this here and we have more of say lupin or something like that, which cattle don't tend to graze, but neither do sage grouse. So so there's a tendency to say, well, we have more forbs, therefore it's good for sage grouse. And again, that is a deceptive claim.
I'm gonna poke at the point raised ranchers, since you brought up leaving the residual matter on the ground.
Yeah.
And I don't know what people think point raised is, if they consider it private land or public land, because it's a real confusing one, but it's public land that's being privately operated.
Right, right.
But these people who are supposed to be the models of how to do things correctly keep getting in trouble, multiple violations by the Park Service, because they don't even leave the required amount of residual matter on the ground. And this is in a place, this is in a national park where people are supposed to be doing it correctly. So you brought up how important that is to wildlife to have that on the ground. So I had to put in my little jab.
The thing that's really particularly upsetting is, in a drought year, you can have 1/3 the forage production that would otherwise happen in, quote, a normal year. And of course, we have a lot of drought years in the West. So that's an issue in itself. But the point being is, most of these grazing models that the government uses for administrating grazing on public lands is based on the normal year. And they don't have a mechanism to reduce grazing pressure on the drought years. So a drought year comes along and you basically you already got 1/3 the production that you're going to have. And now they graze it down to the, bare soil in places. And that destroys that wildlife habitat. And yeah, the cattle can get taken back to the ranch and fed the, hay they brought in for somewhere, but the wildlife has no place else to go. So they are at they seriously decline in those drought years a lot of times due to that impact from the grazing and the lack of management. And then, of course, the reason that the BLM responds that way, or the Forest Service or the Park Service, is they say that, well, the ranchers can't adjust their cattle numbers because in a drought year, they'd have to sell off some cattle or they'd have to buy more hay from some source. And in either case, it costs them more. But they should be managing the land for the people of the United States and the benefit of wildlife, not for the benefit of the rancher. And that's what happens.
The private land, public land, protected land, all have something in common. They're being grazed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just all getting grazed.
Right.
And it's for the benefit of a few. But what's the excuse that it's thrown out? Oh, you got to feed people.
Right.
Well, are you really feeding very many people with that?
Well, that's my point. It's an inefficient way to raise anything. Raising plant food for people. Here's a statistic people don't recognize, but about 90 million acres. It varies from you. I'm using these numbers that are sort of, vary from the price of a product or something. But 90 million acres in this country grows feeder corn, not corn that you buy in the store for corn on the cob, but corn that's fed to livestock for the most part. And 90 million acres, how big is that? Well, California is 100 million acres. It's like if you had Think of California, from the Oregon border down to Mexico and Nevada to the Pacific Ocean. If almost all that was just nothing but cornfields, that's how much we're talking about. And that's to feed primarily cattle, some other livestock, chicken and pigs too, but mostly cattle. And that is a huge impact on the country. I mean, that's a huge amount of land to one species of plant that is fertilized and sprayed with pesticides and so forth to sustain the livestock. And then if you look at the other things that are grown, like soybeans, people think, soybeans, we feed that for tofu or something. Again, about 2% of soybean production goes to human consumption and food. The rest is livestock feed. That's about 75 million acres. So bigger than the state of Oregon or Colorado or any of these other big Western states is devoted to soybean production. And so
I remember that big push. There was a big push.
And then even things like wheat and other things that somewhat is used more for people, even a high percentage of wheat is fed to cattle. So when you add all these crops that we grow across the country to feed livestock, it makes no sense. We could either restore some of that land back to wildlands if we weren't growing crops on them, or we could probably feed the whole world on that food if it weren't going into cows, but were going to direct human consumption.
I want to give a shout out to a regular viewer, DC. The ranching industry, like virtually all extractive and destructive industries, preys on public ignorance and indifference to push their agendas, and people are just getting dumber and more selfish. Well, I agree with you. I don't know if George will go as far as that, but I don't think we're getting more intelligent. We grab a hold of any marketing that allows us not to engage in critical thinking, such as the soybean push that the ranchers really grabbed hold of that one. I saw that being spread everywhere, that you damned vegans, look what you're doing with these soybeans. And I'm like, you're not going to think about the cattle being fed soybeans?
Right. Well, here's another tip for people. I have Google searches that give me, livestock and other searches. Like every day I get scientific papers coming my way. And one of the first things I do is I look at who is the source of this study. In other words, who did it? And who funded it. And so, and you could apply this to pharmaceuticals or anything, actually. I mean, logging, it doesn't matter, but look at who is the source and what their association is. And so, for example, there are what we call range departments around the West, and they know that their job is to promote livestock raising. Why do they know that? Well, a couple of things. There's self-preservation. They get money from the livestock industry to do studies, and that's one of the ways that they sustain themselves. And if there were less livestock, there'd be less jobs for graduates of their range programs, so less people enrolled in it. And as actually has happened, a lot of range programs around the West have just gone away. But so first thing is look who's writing it. And that doesn't mean that and this is the subtle thing, nuance, that doesn't mean that they're fudging their data or doing anything corrupt. But it's what do you choose to emphasize? Kind of like we were saying before. I could do a study that shows that cowbirds benefit from cattle. Exactly. Well, that might be something. I don't have to lie about it. It's true. But you ask, well, why is that a benefit when cowbirds have all these other effects, and they don't necessarily go into the effect on other birds?
Well, it's known. Like it's common knowledge that the ranching promotion of ravens and point raids has led directly to the demise of the snowy plover. I mean, and you think Point Reyes National Seashore is doing anything to do a little video like Audubon put out to tell people about that? Hell no, you got to protect the ranchers. You don't want anyone thinking about that. So there's a happy story with starlings and ranchers are just all. Starlings and ravens are all over ranch lands. But as DC from the Rev mentioned, human intelligence, I think is really sad that considering the source is critical thinking, and too much critical thinking for people to even engage in now. You got to consider the source. Well,
of course. And correct me if I'm wrong, Skylar, but I believe one of the most polluted streams in all of California coast comes off of Point Reyes National Seashore. And think of the irony of that. People like to think of something like a national park unit as being exemplary place for nature and for the environment. And yet Point Reyes has some of the most polluted water on the entire California coast. And I find that, again, you could say, how come the Park Service doesn't have a big sign saying that? Why don't they? It's shown how they've been corrupted by the ranching industry's presence there at the park. And I want to just get into it just real quick, just so people are aware of when the seashore was created and the legislation for it. All the existing ranchers there were bought out. They were paid money for their ranches, except they had this little amendment, or whatever you want to say, clause that said that they could remain on their ranches for 25 years. And as long as it was the original owner and all that. Well, when that 25 years was up, they just protested that, and they got in another extension, and they're continuing to get extensions there. When we bought that land back in the 60s and paid good money for it, and in fact, some of the ranchers just went and bought ranches in other parts of California. They perfectly could do with the money that they had.
They did.
And yet we still have some ranchers left there, and the Park Service has been reluctant to really manage the land for the nature and wildlife that exists there.
They built empires with that money. They got more land. They're wealthy landowners. They developed their political power and purchased lobbyists in order to never leave. But that's another episode.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to mention that so people know what's going on at Point Reyes. So,
it's hard not to talk about diet. It always comes back to diet, because the most damaging things we do is the manner by which we as one species have decided to eat. Leah is commenting here, and she's talking about diet. And Joanne, let's see what Joanne says. Farming is extractive too. Well, I think we were including farming kind of lumped into agriculture.
Yeah.
Tried to make it less so by using sensible soil conservation methods. Ranching is not more extractive than farming, again, if done properly. Well, I bet you have something to say about that, George.
Well, I have two things to say about it. One, most cattle raised in the country depend on being fed at some point in feedlots to fatten them up at the end. So they're dependent on that farming land indirectly. And then, of course, all the pastures and hayfields and so forth is farming too. It's just not crops that we feed ourselves. And so the whole idea, and then you have to look at the whole footprint of what cattle grazing is versus farming for human consumption. And I did an analysis of that years ago, and I'm sure it's changed a little bit. But for example, California produces about half of all the food, the plant food that we eat in the whole country, half of it. And it does so on about 5 or 6 million acres of land. Growing strawberries doesn't take up a lot of land. Growing lettuce doesn't take up a lot of land, and so forth. And so we have the amount of land that would be necessary to feed the entire nation if we weren't trying to also grow forage for livestock would be a tenth or whatever the land area that we're currently using. So even if ranching were less extractive, and I don't necessarily agree with that, but I'll just give credit for that. I'll just say that might be true. It's still a footprint that is much smaller to feed the nation than using livestock. So you can't just make a statement like that without considering the amount of land, the actual footprint of the operations.
I want to tell a little story. And by the way, if anyone wants to call in, I keep putting the call-in link up. If you have a question for George, do you know where Jenner is on the coast?
Yeah.
Here in California? Okay. I drove from there back to Sacramento, and I filmed the entire thing. I never put it out because that's hours of footage to go through, but I was basically just astonished by the hideous destruction of all of that beautiful Marin County and Sonoma County land, the entire drive that was dedicated to livestock. And I just was baffled by the amount of land. I'm like, we couldn't, as the human species, use hours worth of driving past open space to produce enough food for ourselves. I mean, that's a lot of land that we could use to produce non-cattle types of food. And I think about this all the time, because you know that California was a biodiversity hotspot supporting so many animals, and they were all eating, whether they were predators or herbivores or insects, they were all eating. And then the human beings have to, one species decides, well, we've got to destroy that entire system because we want to eat differently. Could we human beings not have just adjusted and also found ways to eat with what Earth was providing?
Well, certainly, this gets into another large issue about population growth too. The human race is now the number one species after livestock, I think, on the planet. I think those are the statistics. But anyway, we occupy a lot of the earth. Our footprint is tremendous, and I just feel like anything we can do to reduce that footprint, either individually or as political entities like governments, is something we have an obligation to do, because the statistics are out there. Most of the rest of the life on the planet is not doing well, and disappearing, and or radically reduced in numbers, and therefore their evolutionary and ecological potential is greatly diminished. And so, just from an ethical point of view, one should be considering what can person do individually to help that along. And there's a whole list of things that I'm not going to get into, but diet is one of the biggest things. I wrote an essay long ago called "Saving the Planet with a Fork," and the idea behind it was, it's articulating this whole thing about eating more plant-based versus meat-based diets, and how that could significantly improve things on the planet for all the other life.
I think it starts where the human brain goes when you are shown that there's a problem. Does your brain go to, what can I do to reduce this? Or does your brain look for an excuse not to change?
Well, we're all, again, resistant to change, but if you were to take a critical look at things, you could come to the conclusion that it's not that hard to eat a little more vegetables and a little less meat. So
I got it. Do you have another couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. From your article, there were two things that I thought people would find interesting that I wanted to hone in on, and that's the providing of posts for predatory birds with fencing, and how that could be promoted as, oh, look, that's great. Look what they're providing. And yet it's actually a bad thing, or it's arguably a bad thing. You want to get into that?
Sure. In a lot of landscapes of the West, the sage steppe is a good example. There were not a lot of high vegetation growth that birds of prey in particular could scan the landscape from. We're talking about hawks, we're talking about ravens, we're talking about eagles, and so forth. And those, but now there are, I don't know if I'd be exaggerating if I say there's millions of miles of fence, but there's a lot of miles of fence spread across the land in these landscapes that formerly did not have any kind of high place for scanning the landscape from. And so the fence posts have become, as you say, you could argue, well, look, at fence posts help eagles hunt better. Well, they do, but it's to the detriment of other species like sage grouse that they may be hunting, and shifts that balance of power. And or even in the indirect way, like I'll use sage grouse again. Sage grouse are slow flyers, and one study showed that up to 30% of the adult mortality in the areas where they were studying was from collisions with fences. Oh, so that becomes a huge mortality factor for a species that's already in decline. So why do we have fences all across the land, including all over the public lands? It's because the livestock are there. If we didn't have the livestock there, we wouldn't need the fences. And so that factor would be reduced, that mortality factor from collisions with fences or from avian predators that are preying upon other birds would be reduced.
And I wanted to bring up all the defunct fencing that gets left up even after ranch land is bought. Everywhere I go, they don't bother to take it down. And that example you just gave is one obvious example of how it's still devastating. If fence collisions cause that sort of a mortality rate, then just because the ranchers left and the fence was causing the problem, then that's still a problem. And I also wanted to ask you how much damage those fences that aren't being used actively for ranching are still contributing to habitat fragmentation.
Why? Say that last part again.
How much are fences that are getting left behind? You know, they're not actively being used anymore, but how much is that still contributing to habitat fragmentation?
Well, you know, the other thing I didn't even mention, this doesn't have anything to do with birds, but a lot of larger mammals, elk, deer, antelope, etc., can be blocked from migrating by the fences, and so that has interrupts their ability to move across the landscape. The fences also wind up funneling all wildlife as well into certain areas that they wouldn't otherwise go just because they want to avoid the fences. So. Or they get hooked on fences. I've got quite a few pictures over the years of, you know, deer that get tangled up in a fence when they try to jump over it and then they die there on the fence. You know, I don't know how significant that is in the overall population, but it's certainly not a nice way to die. So there's a lot of negative impacts that come with fences, and the whole reason why we have fences is primarily for the livestock out there.
Well, George, we used up an hour pretty quickly, and we barely really got in. I mean, we got into some good stuff, but I'd love to have you back if you're willing. I want to try and keep these close to an hour. A teaser for anybody that wants to watch in the future, some other articles of George's. Why ranching won't preclude subdivisions. Did you write that one?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. California wolf restoration. I'll look back. The welcome demise of the conservation collaboration fraud. That sounds pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, for those who are watching, please put in the comments which ones you'd like to hear next. And what questions we didn't answer about Audubon today. I've got an hour and how long did you actually watch that thing that I made?
I watched part of it. I didn't have time to read it.
It was long. It was long. But just like, what was your overall feeling after watching Hooves on the Ground?
Well, it's right to the point and accurate, I think, about what the problems are. So unfortunately, there isn't enough of that kind of information out there for people to see.
Everyone, I put the article that we were talking about today in the description. If you'd like to go to the Wildlife News and read what George wrote, or just get notifications, go to the Wildlife News and you'll start seeing news about his writings, which is quite often. It's impressively often. And you still manage to fit in time for someone like me to come on here and answer questions. So I thank you very much for that.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
And again, I hope that you'll come back. And any closing words for anybody?
Well, just to, be a critical thinker and think through these issues and try to see where you can make adjustments in your life that might be an improvement for the planet. All these things are, the old thing is one person maybe doesn't make a difference, but if, millions of people made a choice like that, it would really be significant. So, and I don't try to preach to people. That's why I say, reduce your meat consumption. I don't say absolutism. You can't eat meat ever. Though, there would be advantages to maybe adopting that as far as beef goes. But anyway, the point is we can all make certain adjustments to one degree or another, and I think help to make things a little better on the planet for everything else that's trying to live here with us.
George made his effort via reduction. For anyone out there that thinks it's not possible, I ate multiple animals on my plate every single day for 40 plus years, and I haven't touched meat or dairy in 8 years, and I'm just fine.
I gave up beef 30 years ago, and
wow.
And it hasn't. I seem to be very healthy. So.
Thanks for your inspiration, George, and thanks everyone who watched.
All right, we'll see you. Bye.